For centuries, spiritual teachers and modern self-help voices have told us that the ego is the root of suffering, a poisonous force that must be destroyed, but this narrative, though popular, hides a profound misunderstanding. The ego is not the enemy of the human soul. It is the structure that makes consciousness possible. 160. It is the part of us that says, I am, that organizes our experiences into identity, and that allows us to navigate the world with some sense of continuity. Without the ego, there is no coherent self. The problem arises when the ego loses its original purpose. Instead of serving as a bridge between our inner essence and the outer world, it becomes corrupted by fear, shame, and the hunger for recognition. At this point, the ego no longer serves us. It enslaves us. It forces us to wear masks, to perform roles, and to live for validation rather than authenticity. This corruption, which Jung called inflation, turns the ego into a fragile dictator, one that cannot tolerate failure, criticism, or imperfection. In such a state, we do not live as ourselves, we survive as characters. 160. And the cost is enormous: exhaustion, emptiness, and disconnection from our own soul. To heal, we must not destroy the ego, but transform it. We must reconnect it to the deeper center of the psyche, the self, and allow it once again to act not as a tyrant, but as a servant of wholeness. At its core, the ego is neither good nor evil. It is simply the structure through which we experience the world. Most people misunderstand the ego as pride, arrogance, or selfishness, but that is only the surface expression of a deeper mechanism. The ego's true purpose is organization. 160. It gathers our fragmented experiences and arranges them into a story. Who am I? Where do I belong? What role do I play? Without this function, human consciousness would collapse into chaos. Imagine waking up each day without memory, without identity, without a sense of continuity. You would not know how to survive in society. The ego protects us from that chaos by creating a stable sense of I. However, the problem is that this stability is fragile, because the ego depends on external approval and recognition to maintain its story. It is easily wounded. A harsh criticism, a social rejection, or even personal failure can feel like an attack on our very existence. 160. That is why the ego reacts defensively, with anger, denial, or projection. Instead of allowing us to grow from mistakes, it convinces us to hide them. Instead of letting us express our authentic selves, it pushes us to wear masks that please others. In this way, the ego begins as a necessary bridge, but slowly turns into a prison. Its hidden nature is not visible until we examine it closely. Only then do we see how much of our daily life is shaped not by conscious choice, but by the fragile need of the ego to survive. 160. The tragedy of the ego is that it cannot tolerate authenticity. It was designed to help us interact with the external world, but over time, it begins to confuse survival with approval. To the ego, authenticity feels dangerous. If I show the world who I truly am, what if I am rejected? What if I am judged? What if I lose my place in the tribe? Because of this fear, the ego begins to demand masks. We wear the mask of the perfect child, the successful professional, the always happy friend. Each mask is a performance designed to gain acceptance, but each one takes us further away from our authentic self. 160. The danger is subtle but profound. We begin to believe that the mask is who we are. We identify so strongly with these roles that we forget there is a deeper self beneath them. This corruption does not happen overnight. It begins in childhood, when approval from parents, teachers, and peers feels like survival itself. Slowly, the ego learns that love is conditional, that to be safe, you must please. By adulthood, most of us are so deeply trapped in this pattern that we cannot tell the difference between our true desires and the desires imposed upon us by society. The result is emptiness. 160. Even when we achieve success, it feels hollow, because deep down, we know the success belongs to the mask, not the real self. The applause goes to the performance, not the soul. This is how the ego corrupts authenticity. It convinces us that survival requires pretending, and in the process, it robs us of the very thing that makes life meaningful, the courage to live as who we truly are. The ego did not develop by accident. It evolved as a survival tool. In early human history, belonging to the group meant safety, while rejection often meant death. To ensure acceptance, the ego learned to adapt. It presented only those traits that guaranteed approval, and it hid the ones that might provoke rejection. Even today, this ancient survival mechanism continues to shape our behavior. 160. Every time we hesitate to speak the truth, every time we suppress an emotion, every time we perform a role just to fit in, we are witnessing the ego's survival instinct in action. This strategy may protect us in the short term, but it comes with long-term costs. By prioritizing survival over authenticity, the ego creates a false self, a version of us that is designed for approval rather than truth. This false self becomes the mask we wear in society, the hard-working professional, the obedient child, the charming friend. While these roles may bring temporary acceptance, they prevent us from ever being truly seen, and what is not seen cannot be loved. This is why so many people feel lonely even in relationships, or restless even in success. The ego's survival strategy has disconnected them from genuine connection. Ironically, the ego's attempt to protect us from danger often creates the very suffering it tries to avoid. By hiding our true self, we end up isolated, anxious, and unfulfilled. The lesson here is not to eliminate the ego, but to recognize when it has shifted from being a tool for survival to becoming a barrier to authentic living. Real strength comes not from pleasing the world, but from learning to survive as who we truly are. One of the most deceptive aspects of the ego is its obsession with control. The ego believes that if it can predict, manage, and dominate every outcome, it can protect us from uncertainty and pain. This illusion creates the constant urge to manipulate circumstances, people, and even our own emotions. We try to control how others see us. We try to control how the future unfolds. We even try to control how reality itself behaves. But life, by its very nature, resists control. The more the ego struggles to hold on, the more fragile and anxious it becomes. This obsession often shows up in subtle ways. A perfectionist who fears failure is not striving for excellence, but trying to control how they are perceived. A person who avoids vulnerability in relationships is not protecting themselves, but attempting to control the unpredictable nature of love. Even anger, in many cases, is an egoic attempt to control a situation by force. Yet, no matter how much control we try to impose, uncertainty always breaks through. The deeper tragedy is that the ego mistakes control for safety. It does not realize that true freedom comes not from control, but from surrender, accepting the flow of life rather than resisting it. Ancient philosophies like Taoism and Buddhism emphasize this truth. Life cannot be dominated, it can only be aligned with. When the ego loosens its grip and allows space for trust, creativity, and spontaneity, we discover a peace that control can never deliver. The illusion of control is powerful, but breaking it is the first step toward inner liberation. At the heart of the ego lies a deep and unrelenting fear, the fear of death. This is not only about physical death, but also the symbolic deaths that occur in everyday life, the death of an old identity, the end of a relationship, the loss of status, or the shattering of an illusion. The ego thrives on continuity. It survives by maintaining the story of I. Anything that threatens this story feels like annihilation. That is why the ego reacts so violently to failure, humiliation, or change. To the deeper self, these moments may simply be transitions, opportunities for growth and transformation, but to the ego, they feel like the end of existence. This fear drives much of human behavior. We cling to possessions. We chase achievements. We desperately seek recognition, all in the hope that something of us will endure. Even our resistance to change often stems from this fear. The ego would rather remain trapped in suffering than face the uncertainty of transformation. Yet, paradoxically, every spiritual tradition teaches that true freedom comes only when we face this fear directly. By confronting impermanence, we realize that the self the ego tries to preserve was never solid to begin with. When we accept the inevitability of change and death, a profound shift occurs. Instead of fighting against reality, we learn to flow with it. Instead of fearing loss, we begin to see endings as gateways to new beginnings. The ego may tremble at this realization, but the deeper self welcomes it as liberation. Death, both literal and symbolic, ceases to be the enemy and becomes the doorway to authenticity and renewal. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of human life is the confusion between the ego and the true self. The ego insists, "I am all there is." It identifies with names, roles, achievements, and failures, believing these external markers define reality, but beneath this fragile construction lies the self, a deeper, timeless center of consciousness that is not limited by circumstances. While the ego divides, the self unites. While the ego fears, the self rests in trust. The problem arises when we mistake the voice of the ego for the whole of who we are. This confusion creates endless suffering. When the ego fails, when we lose a job, when a relationship ends, when our image is shattered, we feel as if we have died, but this is not the truth. What has collapsed is only the mask, not the essence. The self remains untouched, waiting for us to remember it. Jung described this as individuation, the process of moving beyond ego identification and reconnecting with the deeper self. This does not mean destroying the ego. It means reordering it, placing it in service of the self, rather than allowing it to dominate. In practical terms, this shift changes everything. Success is no longer about recognition, but about alignment with purpose. Relationships are no longer about validation, but about authentic connection. Failures are no longer humiliations, but opportunities for growth. The ego's voice of fear begins to quiet down, and the deeper voice of wisdom emerges. To live from the self is to live from wholeness, and when the ego learns to serve rather than rule, it finally finds peace. The first step in healing the ego is awareness. Most people live unconsciously, reacting to the world without realizing that their choices are driven by the ego's fear and hunger for validation. Awareness interrupts this automatic cycle. When we observe our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors without judgment, we begin to see the ego for what it truly is, a set of patterns, not our true essence. For example, when you notice yourself becoming defensive after criticism, awareness allows you to pause and ask, why am I reacting this way? What part of me feels threatened? In that moment of observation, the ego loses its grip. Awareness is not about fighting the ego, it is about shining light on its illusions. Once exposed, many of its tricks lose their power. Practices like mindfulness, meditation, journaling, and shadow work are powerful tools for developing this kind of self-observation. They create distance between the observing self and the reacting ego, allowing us to act from clarity instead of compulsion. Over time, this awareness brings humility. We begin to see that we are not our thoughts, that we are not our roles, that we are not even our wounds, that we are the witness behind them. Healing the ego is not a quick process. It requires patience, honesty, and courage. But as awareness deepens, the ego gradually shifts from being a tyrant to being a servant. It no longer controls us with fear, but instead becomes a tool for expressing the deeper truths of the self. Awareness is the medicine that restores balance, reminding us that the ego is not our enemy, but neither is it our master. The ultimate goal of understanding and transforming the ego is inner freedom. Freedom does not mean living without responsibility or challenges. It means living without being enslaved by fear, masks, and illusions. When the ego dominates, we are trapped in cycles of approval-seeking, perfectionism, and control. But when the ego is realigned with the self, life opens into a new dimension, one of authenticity, courage, and peace. Inner freedom is not about destroying the ego, but about integrating it. The ego becomes a functional tool for navigating daily life, while no longer dictating our worth. We can pursue success without being defined by it. We can love without fear of rejection. We can face failure without losing our identity. this freedom allows us to engage with life fully, without constantly needing to prove, defend, or justify ourselves. Philosophical traditions across the world describe this state in different ways. In Buddhism, it is the end of attachment. That in Stoicism, it is freedom from passion's tyranny. In Jungian psychology, it is individuation. But when the ego is realigned with the self, life opens into a new dimension, one of authenticity, courage, and peace. Inner freedom is not about destroying the ego, but about integrating it. The ego becomes a functional tool for navigating daily life, while no longer dictating our worth. That we can pursue success without being defined by it.